dream. One day, this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Black Men Thinkin.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
Black Men Thinkin.
Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you are dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Black Men Thinkin.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Black Men Thinkin.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Black Men Thinkin.
Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinking, here on the dominant force in internet conservatism, TalkAmericaRadio.us. Also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia. WJHC, Talk 107.5 North Florida Talk Radio. FreedomInAmericaRadio.com, and WLBB News Talk AM 1330 in Carrollton, Georgia. Happy to be with you again. And let's get back on a subject that the media seems to want to avoid. The best way to characterize this is by something that was said by James Carville back in 1992 during that presidential election campaign.
Stay focused. Talk about things that matter to people. It's the economy, stupid.
Exactly. But the media doesn't want to talk about that. And I believe the reason that would be that doing so would actually help someone that they have determined to be an enemy. And that, of course, would be the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Because the economy is doing well. How well? Well, remember, we had 3% growth, GDP growth, 3% annualized GDP growth at the end of the second quarter. So we were looking at that and then trying to figure out, well, what was going to happen. And you got to remember that there were a whole lot of people saying that that was kind of a one-off. Well, we had 3%, but that's not going to happen again. That's not real. It's all these other things. For example, Bloomberg back in August talked about the economic forecast going forward, and they had this to say.
My colleague Michael McKee was out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming last week for the Kansas City Fed's Economic Policy Symposium. He sat down with Alan Auerbach, the economist at the University of California, Berkeley, father of the so-called border-adjusted tax, and he asked him if he thinks that by doing tax reform we could get to 3% growth. And let's listen to what Professor Auerbach had to say.
Getting to 3% from just under 2% is a pretty big lift, and it's hard to think of any realistic policy option that would make that big a change.
He calling it a pretty big lift. This is hugely important to what the administration is saying about the prospects for growth. When you look at models, when Barclays looks on, do you see that happen? Do you see us getting to 3% growth anytime soon?
We don't. Our Barclays economists on the research side do not see that happening. They see trend growth in the 2s instead. But we have to think now going forward, what's the process to get this done? In September, we have to get a budget done. We have to do a debt limit hike sometime in the fall. At Barclays Research, we've published saying that we think you can see modest tax cuts by the end of Q1 18, probably not some sort of comprehensive tax reform. Issues like infrastructure spending, we've seen very little detail on that, so I'm not really optimistic on it.
What's your sense of the prioritization? You mentioned all the Congress faces when lawmakers get back to town here in early September, and it's a lot of mandatory stuff. It's funding the government. It's making sure the lights stay on. It's raising that debt limit so that the U.S. can pay its bills. How much flexibility do lawmakers have here to elevate tax reform, to make it something that they tackle in the near term?
I think it's really, it's going to be first fiscal, budget, debt limit, and number 2 is tax reform on that list. You have to imagine that for them is extremely important. For Republican leadership, they do not want to walk into a midterm election having failed on health care and having failed on tax reform. They're going to want to get something done. For the administration, there's one other thing to include, and that's trade reform policy. You've begun the NAFTA renegotiations. Round 1 is over. We have 2 more rounds here in September, to look forward to in September. And the administration's been very aggressive on its trade policy.
What's your advice to clients who see what the president tweets or hear him talk and he'll raise the specter of maybe having a shutdown to pay for the wall or throwing out NAFTA entirely? How much credence do you give that? How much credence should an investor give what the president is saying versus what the official line is from other members of the administration?
It's important to listen to what the president's saying for obvious reasons, so it is important to read his Twitter. I always tell clients, read our research at Barclays, and you'll find out better what we're thinking about this. But I think take a step back and remember, Congress has to pass tax reform legislation. It's not up to the president. He may talk about a repatriation tax. He may talk about getting the corporates down to 15%. He may talk about the use of tariffs in the tax code. But some of these issues will reside in Congress. On other issues, it's very important to see what the president's thinking, especially on issues like trade. How does he feel about NAFTA renegotiation? This issue on the budget really will come down to something we've been saying for a while, the border wall with Mexico and how it gets funded. That's something that's very important for the administration.
Well, in all that gobbledygook, the things that I take away from that are hearing a California Berkeley economist saying getting from just under 2% to 3% is a big lift, and he didn't see any policy prescriptions that would get anyone there. I wonder what he's saying now that we've had a second consecutive quarter of 3% growth. Now, I recognize that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, can very easily revise something downward. They do that all the time over at BLS and BEA. They revise things up, they revise things down for whatever reasons, good, bad, or indifferent, that they choose to do, choose to explain that with. However, remember this. The first time that Donald Trump hit 3% annualized GDP growth was in the second quarter of 2017, which, to be honest with you, is his first real quarter as president. The second time was the third quarter of 2017, which was his second real quarter as president. He's 2 for 2 with no Obama influence on the economy. Oh, by the way, this occurred even though you had the hurricanes in the month of September. People don't want to really look at that. August and September, I believe. And even on CNBC, they had this discussion, which you had basically members of the panel calling out another member of the panel who had dismissed the idea of consecutive 3% GDP growth quarters as not likely, not going to happen.
Well, first of all, I saw this GDP report as like a free play, like the defense went off sides and the quarterback got to do whatever he wanted to do because it didn't matter if he threw a touchdown. But this is sort of a touchdown in a couple ways. I don't know if you remember, but I've been talking all quarter long about how remarkable it's been that I've been incapable of really seeing the hurricane impacts in the data. We had a brief period where people brought their forecast down into the 1% range. That kind of went away as the data came in. And now what's happening is you actually had a slowing of the consumer from 3.3 down to 2.4. But it's really the business investment that also slowed, but is doing good enough, along with equipment spending up at 8.6%. And I haven't looked at the inventory number yet, but or the net trade number. The federal government is spending a bit more than they were spending previously, believe it or not.
So it's 3%.
It's 3 off of 3.1, and the 3.1.
3.1 and then 3. Okay, so we've heard the president likes to say, I got us back to 3% quicker than anyone said, but he's talking about one quarter, and everybody immediately points out that Obama had more than a few 3% quarters.
Yeah.
Did Obama ever have back-to-back 3%?
I don't know that. I'll look at that while
you don't know that? But okay, now we do have a back-to-back 3%. This is going to be big trouble for you. This is going to be big trouble for you if it gets a third and then a fourth. If it goes for me,
why for me? As if I don't want stronger economic growth?
Yeah, that's why. Because you said 3% is not possible.
So we're going to spend time with you imputing what I hope for and wish. I have been on the show before, and I have always hoped for more jobs.
Back-to-back 3%.
Can we bring?
In 2014, there were several.
When?
In 2014, Q2 and Q3.
So you get that. So, yes, in 2014, there were a couple of, actually, they were better than 4.5% quarters of growth under Obama. Of course, they were preceded by horrific numbers, and I do mean horrific. In 2014, there was, in quarter number 2, 4.6 annualized growth. In quarter 3, 5.2 annualized growth. That was sandwiched in between a first quarter where you had minus 0.9% growth and a fourth quarter where growth was 2%. Net effect, you still couldn't get 3% out of that year, 2014. There were no 3% growth years under Barack Hussein Obama. Now you have half a year with Trump where we're at 3%. Why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we discussing the fact that there are 2 consecutive quarters under Donald Trump, his first 2 real consecutive quarters, where growth is up? Why aren't we talking about it's an unexpected increase? Because the expectation was 2.5%. Why aren't we talking about the increase in inventory investment and a lowering trade deficit that made the hurricane impact negligible to the point where who knows where it would have been without the hurricanes? Consumer spending actually slowed down. There was even a decline in construction. All of these things can probably be blamed in one way or another on the hurricanes. Despite that, you hit 3% annualized GDP growth. Do you have any idea where we might be really? Do you have any idea? Now, as James Carville said,
stay focused. Talk about things that matter to people. It's the economy, stupid.
But we're not talking about that. We're talking about whatever happened to some investigation that never had teeth, that never had truth. We're looking at other things. We're talking about personalities which do nothing for the American people, and not talking about the economy that does everything for them. Help me understand how that makes sense. Speaking of things that actually matter to people, again from CNBC, and this was on the 4th of October, so we're talking about September, again, a month that we had pretty big hits from hurricanes. Private sector job growth of 135,000 jobs in September versus a 125,000 job growth estimate, and that was according to ADP. 10,000 more jobs than they were expected. It was a sharp decline from the month of August before, almost 100,000 jobs down from that. But again, the monthly decline in hiring was due in part to damage from Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. Let me try to put this in a very simple perspective for you. The economy, without any particular policy prescriptions, if you want to say that, except that regulations have been rolled back. Obamacare is being gutted. Call that a policy prescription if you wish, or not. But with nothing more than that, because tax reform has not been passed, Obamacare has not been repealed. It has been blunted. It is going the way of the dodo bird, but it is still on the books. You put all that together and you're left with one thing very important. Despite what people are not seeing go well. Hurricanes are not a boon to the economy, not while they're happening. A lack of tax reform is not going to help the economy. Tax reform would make it go much better. Despite those things not being there, the economy is strong. One could only imagine, again, what would the numbers look like had there been no hurricane damage or not significant hurricane damage. One could only imagine what the numbers would look like if tax reform on the books going into 2018 were there as opposed to still being debated. The thing that got Donald Trump elected is going just the way he said it would, but not as well as he had hoped because of inaction on the part of Congress. And all of the naysayers who are still worried about things that the American people don't necessarily care that much about. I don't know anybody who cares about Russia who's not a liberal. And not because they care about Russia, because they hate Donald Trump. They don't care about unemployment still breaking new ground to the low side. They don't care about the fact, and black people are the funniest to me. You have the lowest unemployment that you've seen this century. It didn't happen under Obama. And no, it wasn't set up by Obama. There's nothing that Obama did that improved the economy or set the economy up for improvement. Had that been the case with stimulus spending and everything else he had a chance to do in his first year in office, you would have seen a benefit before the 8th year was complete. But you did not. Because he did not. Well, Donald Trump hasn't done anything. Let me help you out with something. His mere presence and knowing that he is in business to make things better for Americans has given that same attitude toward the rest of the American economy. At the end of the day, the economy is about the attitudes of people. So maybe we should be talking about what matters. It is the economy, which they said could not sustain 3% GDP growth for a year or in a year. But it's already halfway there with Donald Trump. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin'. We'll be back right after this. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin', here on the dominant force in internet conservatism, TalkAmericaRadio.us, also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia, WJHC, Talk 107.5 North Florida Talk Radio, FreedomInAmerica.com, and WLBB News Talk AM 1330 in Carrollton, Georgia. Moving on to another topic, has anyone now noticed, and it seems to have come about rather quickly, although it was a long time in the making, that pretty much all the allegations that people were making against Donald Trump have now become crimes of which it is almost certain Hillary Clinton is a perpetrator. What do I mean by that? Well, there's all kinds of things. Well, there's three things in particular. Let me just focus on three because there's so many. And we're not talking about going over the same old ground with Comey, who decided to exonerate Hillary Clinton even before the investigation into what she was doing was over. We now know that letter that he basically read to both indict and exonerate her at the same time, that happened in May. No investigation was made. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He had already decided Jim Comey is dirty, but he hasn't been held accountable. There's a theme there. We'll come back to that. But let's talk about this Russian dossier, this thing that was determined was going to undo Donald Trump because of all they found out about him and all that could be come up. Now, Donald Trump always said, it's fake news. But now here's what we're finding out about this. This was from ABC.
To that controversial dossier prepared as opposition research on then-candidate Donald Trump, alleging connections between the Trump campaign and Russia. It's believed that firm was first hired by a Republican opponent, and then the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee funded it from there. So tonight we now know who funded it, but some lawmakers say the bigger question remains, how much of it is true? Here's ABC's chief investigative correspondent Brian Ross.
Until now, Hillary Clinton and her campaign team would not admit any connection to the Trump dossier. The 35-page document, prepared by a former British spy, alleges the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians and includes uncorroborated, salacious allegations about Trump himself. It didn't come out until well after the campaign ended.
It's all fake news. It's phony stuff. It didn't happen.
The dossier on Trump was produced by a Washington-based firm called Fusion GPS, which had actually started digging up dirt on Trump for an unknown Republican during the primaries. After several Republican candidates dropped out, the Clinton campaign and the Democrats secretly paid Fusion GPS to continue their research efforts. The president today said he was a victim.
I think it's a disgrace.
Former Clinton campaign spokesperson Brian Fallon said the Democrats did nothing wrong.
I think it's important to remember that opposition research happens all the time in campaigns.
In fact, it's standard practice in campaigns for both parties.
I think it's important to know who paid for this dossier. What is more important than anything is whether the allegations in the dossier are true.
And now one question is, which Republican first started Fusion GPS down the road of digging up dirt on Trump?
Do you know who those Republicans are? Do you have any idea?
I think I would have, if I were to guess, I have one name in mind.
Give it to us.
It'll probably be revealed.
Clearly, the president did not want to reveal who he thinks it is. Brian Ross with us now. So we now know the Hillary Clinton campaign, the DNC, funding this dossier. Right. What we don't know is the Republican who hired this firm in the first place.
Well, Dave, the Democrats say that the firm contacted them in early March, which was just after several Republican candidates had dropped out of the race. And their supporters are now the prime suspects, David.
Brian Ross with us again tonight. Thanks, Brian.
Let's be clear. We know who it likely is, and it's John McCain, as far as the Republican who had something to do with it. Now, I could be wrong. I'm speculating just like anyone else, but I don't know of a Republican who hates Donald Trump more, an elected official in Washington, D.C., who hates Donald Trump more than John McCain. Because Donald Trump exploded the myth of his war hero status. John McCain is not a war hero. John McCain is just this side of traitorous and has been throughout his public career. It's just a matter of how much does he have to be exposed to accomplish undermining anything that works for liberty and freedom of the American people, as opposed to holding the majority of the American people captive to one or more special interest that prohibits them from living at liberty. But now we know that the dossier was, here's the interesting thing. You say opposition research goes on all the time. However, how often do you go up and dig up things that you know are false and then put them out there, make sure they get out being false, and you know you can't prove anything because there's nothing to prove. There's not a shred of anything verifiable or valid or tangibly correct in the dossier. And for Democrats to come out and say, well, it really doesn't matter who funded it, it matters whether or not it's true. You've had the thing since March of last year. You had this thing during the campaign. You had people who could look into it. You had all this stuff. And guess what? Nothing. Nothing. Because it was always a lie. And that's what they don't want you to really pay too much attention to, the fact that it is a lie. Another thing that has blown up, and it should get more consideration than it is, both the Democrats and the press are doing their best to step all over this flare-up before it becomes a wildfire, and that is the whole deal with Fusion GPS and the Uranium One scandal.
Hillary Clinton recently launched her presidential campaign promising to be champion for the middle class. Yet she seems to be more of a champion for herself and foreign governments by accepting hundreds of millions of dollars in donations to her piggy bank, the Clinton Foundation. Judge Jeanine Pirro said the structure of the foundation is much like a criminal organization.
This interconnection between a foundation and their personal wealth and the removal of any kind of transparency is what criminals do.
Canadian businessman Frank Giustra, along with Bill and Hillary Clinton, were part of a group that built, financed, and eventually sold off to the Russians a company that would become known as Uranium One.
His company was like a bit player and really had gone from a worthless shell company overnight, got this huge uranium mining deal, and then soon after that, Bill Clinton got a huge donation, $31 million from Frank Giustra to his charitable foundation.
The Russian government controls Uranium One and now controls over 20% of America's uranium supply, which it can sell to other countries who are our bitter enemies, like Iran. This jeopardizes both our national and energy security.
When you talk to people on the ground, uranium has left the United States, has gone to Canada, has gone overseas. Nuclear power provides about 20% of the electricity for our country. I think there's an issue of national security as well as energy security, and I worry about Iran getting this uranium.
As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton had to be involved in the approval of Uranium One's sale to Russia.
That deal to go through, it needs federal government approval, and one of those people that has to approve that deal is Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton looking more like a mob boss than a president. Thanks for joining me.
That was Western journalism from early 2015. We've known about this for a while. Can anyone tell me why we were talking about Russian collusion, which was fanciful and lacked proof? We were always trying to find the proof of that and ignoring the facts of what had already happened with Hillary Clinton. I don't get it. So we know that Hillary Clinton went out and paid people who were connected to a foreign government to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. And they call that opposition research. Okay. We know Hillary Clinton got money from Russia and other foreign agencies in connection with a uranium deal that put 20% of the United States supply of uranium into the hands of Russia. And that transaction could not have occurred without her approval or that of the department of which she was head. Couldn't go. She had to approve it. We know this. These are things that are not even disputed. But we're still chasing Donald Trump bogeymen all across the relitigated, let me get this straight, they are still trying to relitigate the 2016 general election. Well, if this happens, then Trump should be impeached. He should be replaced. We should install someone as president. And they're talking about the United States when they bring this idea up. Doesn't that strike you as a little bit odd? A little bit un-American, a little bit anti-liberty? But, of course, the big thing, of course, is Russian collusion. Was anyone colluding with Russia to rig the election? The allegations against Donald Trump have been out there for, oh my gosh, how long? Here is the problem, though, as Trump spends more time in office and more of the swamp gets revealed.
Mark Stein is an author and columnist. He joins us tonight. Mark, I want to talk to you because I know that you're an internationally renowned connoisseur of irony. And so how are you responding to the story which was designed to prove collusion between Republicans and Russia and is now proving the opposite?
Yes, because Trump is in the weird position. He says wacky things from time to time, as we all know, but nothing he says is as wacky as the truth here. This is like one of those slightly over high concept thrillers. Agatha Christie's Murder on the Siberian Express. Everyone is colluding with Russia except Trump. Basically, you've got the Podesta group, you've got the Hillary campaign, you've got the DNC, you've got the FBI, you've got Christopher Steele, who you credit as an ex-MI6 agent. He's not just any old ex-MI6 agent. He's the head of the Russia desk at MI6, which is a pretty big deal. And you were talking about campaign finance laws preventing you paying foreign nationals for federal election campaigns. Whatever the scope of those laws, the core people they were designed to prevent getting a hand in American elections were elite, high-level espionage agents from foreign powers. So we have a completely and by the way, not just the Hillary campaign, but as you said earlier, Hillary herself. Hillary, who has been touring the world. She's been at obscure little literary festivals on the Welsh border just a week or two ago, complaining that the Russians colluded with Trump to steal the election away with her, and she's colluding with the Russians to issue this dossier against Trump.
Colluding with the Russians and apparently with the peripheral involvement of Paul Manafort, who Democrats have been telling us for the last year is this sinister figure with Russia ties. You know, maybe so, sounds like it. But he was working with the Podesta Group, which is the single most powerful Democratic lobbying firm in the city, of course, founded by Hillary's campaign chairman. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
No, and you know, suddenly a lot of things seem clearer. You talked about the FBI, which is supposed to be a policing agency that operates in the interests of the American people. As you say, it's very odd that an agency with almost unlimited resources compared to any equivalent anywhere on the planet is having to outsource a lot of this stuff and actually use the taxpayers' money to pay this British subject for this wacky report. But to me, one of the most disturbing things about this is you'll recall that the Director of National Intelligence, Clapper, asked James Comey, supposedly, to go and have a meeting with Trump and tell Trump that they've got a dossier explaining how he likes to enjoy highly specialized prostitution services in Eastern Europe, and they've got this dossier. And then the minute they've held the meeting, it mysteriously the news of this meeting gets leaked to the press. And I think it's a reasonable inference that Clapper and Comey only actually arranged this meeting with Trump to tell him of the specialized prostitution services this dossier contains about him. It's a reasonable inference that this meeting took place only so that news of it could then be leaked to the press. That's actually extremely deeply disturbing for the intelligence community and the FBI.
And I would, by the way, I agree with you vehemently. And if they were doing this to President Obama, who I did not like, I would say the same thing. You can't have rogue agencies. It's terrifying. Mark, thank you for that perspective.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Everybody and their dog, with the exception of Donald Trump. You have the opposing party. You had the party which actually gave him the nomination he wanted. You have the deep state, you have the FBI, you have the director of you have all these people along with colluding with the British and the Russians against Donald Trump, trying to do everything they can to make sure he is discredited so that he cannot possibly prevail in the 2016 general election. And none of that stuff worked. And it's not because they didn't do good work. It's not because they didn't do enough. It's because the American people tuned them out. Because they're not always as dumb as the liberal left believes them to be. They understand when someone's pulling their leg. They understand when someone's blowing sunshine up their skirt. And they don't believe that Donald Trump is that guy. But they know Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's been dirty since the 1970s, and she had to be fired from the Watergate investigation. She was fired for unethical behavior. She's been dirty since she represented a man whose violent sexual abuse of a preteen left that child comatose. And Hillary represented her client zealously, implying that the young girl wanted to have violent sex with a predator. This is the same Hillary Clinton who has caped for Bill Clinton and his sexual predation for decades. People know who Hillary Clinton is. They just don't like what she is. And she never won anything. Well, she was senator. No, you know what? She went to a cesspool and was no different than any of the other things that swim around in it, and that was in New York. But in a national election, what did she win? She lost to Barack Obama when the cards were stacked against him. She went and outright cheated Bernie Sanders. She didn't win the nomination. She stole the nomination, but she couldn't steal the election. And now everything that she tried to use to discredit, to defeat, to tarnish, to smear Donald Trump is coming to light and painting her as the career criminal actor that she has been since the late 1970s. It's fascinating. The only real question is anyone going to pay attention enough to really shut this down? This really gets back to the brazenness of the actors here. If Comey had thought, if Jim Comey had believed that he was going to answer for his crimes against the United States, he wouldn't have done it. Someone gave him the wink of the eye to let him know, we got you. Hillary Clinton's as dirty as mud. Matter of fact, a pigsty looks sanitary in comparison to Hillary Clinton. And she has yet to face even an indictment. Charges at all. Any real investigations? No. And the bigger fish out there, Barack Obama seems to have enough sense to keep his mouth shut for the most part. But this is why Donald Trump won. The American people saw what was going on in their government. They saw what was going on in Washington, D.C., and they finally heard someone talking about, I'm not here to try to schmooze with them. I'm here to try to do something on your behalf. That resonated, and despite all of the efforts to diminish him, to discredit him, to distract him, to destroy him, both before the election and since, Donald Trump has gone about not only making promises the American people wanted to hear, but holding up his end to keep them. This matters. And this is why I suspect he will be exonerated, along with the fact that the likelihood that any of the things that of which he's being accused are things that he's actually done, well, it's almost nil. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin', we'll be back right after this. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin', here on the dominant force in Internet Conservatism, TalkAmericaRadio.us. Also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia. WJHC, Talk 107.5, North Florida Talk Radio. FreedomInAmericaRadio.com and WLBB News Talk AM 1330 in Carrollton, Georgia. Well, moving along with the show, we got to talk about this Mueller thing, because Mueller, the special counsel or the special investigator, whatever you're going to call him, he delivered sealed indictments on Friday with the idea that those who are being charged should be picked up as early as Monday. And this is pretty interesting now to me, because of all the things swirling around with Mueller and his relationship with Comey, and whether or not everything is on the up and up there, and everything with how many people who are affiliated or connected to Hillary Clinton that were hired by Mueller for this investigation. And here's how CNN talked about the indictments that were handed down this past Friday.
It is a landmark moment in the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Sources briefed on the matter say a federal grand jury in Washington approved the first charges in the investigation led by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. A spokesman for the Special Counsel's office declined to comment. The indictments are sealed, but plans are underway for anyone charged to be taken into custody as soon as Monday.
When you see a sealed indictment like this, it almost always happens for one reason. There's a fear that the defendant is going to flee the jurisdiction.
Mueller wants to send a signal to other prospective defendants. If this person who has been indicted or persons are facing 20 to 40 to 50 years for whatever these crimes are related to collusion or not, there are others who may be subject to similar charges who have further knowledge about dealings with Russia.
The Special Counsel's investigation focused on potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, as well as obstruction of justice by the president, who might have tried to impede the investigation. CNN reported that investigators are scrutinizing the president and his associates' financial ties to Russia.
This is what we've been waiting for, to see if investigators will bring charges in this probe that even impacts the president to a degree, because investigators have been looking at his potential involvement in obstruction of justice. You see him tweeting about it, calling it a witch hunt, a hoax, saying that it's a waste of taxpayer dollars.
Mueller's team has also examined foreign lobbying conducted by former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and others. The Special Counsel has issued subpoenas for documents and testimony to a handful of figures, including some people close to Manafort and others involved in a Trump Tower meeting between Russians and campaign officials.
And this may be an indication that he's not trying to show his hand because he doesn't want people to be able to either conceal evidence, destroy evidence. It may be the reason that he was able to do a surprise, no knock and announce warrant on Paul Manafort's home. There is an urgency that Robert Mueller is seeing, and it may be a flight risk. It may also be because there are some missing pieces.
That last part is so very important. There may be some missing pieces. Why do I say that? Let's not forget that how over the last few weeks, the whole Trump-Russia collusion story has evolved and reversed into a Clinton-Russia collusion story, and the facts that are coming out with respect to that are simply that. They're not allegations that we hope somebody can prove. These are things that are documented about the Clintons and their relationships or interactions with Russians. And also the DNC doing the same. So there are documents to show that, which are not part of some dossier which is funded by some foreign character coming up with some idea trying to slam or to smear Hillary Clinton. You don't really need to smear Hillary Clinton. All you need to do is let sunlight come out upon her, and she looks like what she looks like, both politically and physically. But I digress. The real issue that we have here is, so what is it that you are trying to do by sealing the indictment? Well, we have to worry about a flight risk. I don't think that's the issue, not with the facts that we are seeing in this case. I think it is the missing pieces. Who are you going to arrest? You haven't even proven anything in the court of public opinion except among progressives who never needed any proof to come to the conclusion that everything associated with Donald John Trump is fraudulent. He should not be president. He should never have been elected, and Hillary Clinton should be installed. Or let's go really reaching. Let's find a way to get Bernie in there. Oh my gosh. This is interesting. According to CNN Politics, the charges are still sealed under orders from a federal judge. Plans were prepared for Friday for anyone charged to be taken into custody as soon as Monday. It's not clear what the charges even are. Mueller was appointed in May to lead the investigation into the Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Under the regulations governing special counsel investigations, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who has oversight over the Russia investigation, that's because Jeff Sessions made the unwise decision to recuse himself. But Rosenstein would have been made aware of any charges before they were taken before the grand jury for approval. Let's remember what these charges mean, whatever they are. Remember the saying, a district attorney can indict a ham sandwich. There is nothing special about the aspect of there being a grand jury indictment. That doesn't mean you have anything that you can prove. You go into a grand jury, you present one side of the story and one side only in an effort to convince a group of people, usually if I remember correctly, a group of 23 people, whether or not there's enough there. Well, can we at least go to trial with this and see if there's anything else? He got that. He made that happen. Is he going to get the president for collusion? There's no evidence of that. So the question is, what are the charges? Is he going to get the president's sons for collusion? Everything about that meeting was put out in public, and not for the least of which reason, Don Trump Jr. basically said, I'm going to make my statement to the public before you guys get me behind closed doors and then change whatever I say into something that you want out there for public consumption. Of course, that last part is my add-on, but that's kind of the reason. Let me tell you why I make public statements when people want me to talk to them privately and behind closed doors. I don't trust them. I don't think they're going to be faithful to what I have to say. And after I speak to them, then I have issues if I say anything, because they can say that I violated some type of trust. I was under oath. I was under orders. And anything I say that they don't like, even though no one knows what I said in there or out, now becomes something that can be hung around my neck. So before I go in there and talk to you, make my statement publicly. So if I then decide to make a statement afterward, it can simply agree with what I said before, and therefore you can't get me. The Trumps aren't dumb. The problem is the swamp is very swarmy. And Jim Mueller is part of the swamp. I'm struck, to be honest with you, how Mueller got this gig, because it is pretty interesting. Back in June of 2017, Real Clear Politics ran a very short piece regarding Robert Mueller, saying he has a disqualifying conflict of interest. He has a conflict of interest. Special Counsel Robert Mueller has a problem. He has a disqualifying conflict of interest regarding a large part of his work. It involves a choice between investigating or relying on former FBI Director James Comey, a longtime close friend of Mueller's. Ideally, Mueller will recognize that and resign, but if he doesn't resign, Attorney General Jeff Sessions should appoint another special counsel to take over the obstruction of justice part of the investigation where Mueller is disqualified. Because there are two investigations, one into whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians, a claim that even Democrat Chris Matthews admitted fell apart after Comey's recent testimony, and an investigation into whether, while being investigated for this claimed collusion, President Trump or someone else obstructed justice. That investigation is closely tied to Comey, and so is Mueller. WCVB in Boston covered this, or put a piece out about this, the next month in July, saying this.
President Trump's team may be looking into ways to undercut the special counsel's investigation. The Washington Post reporting the president has been asking about his pardoning powers related to aides, relatives, and even himself. The paper also says his lawyers are building a case of alleged conflicts of interest surrounding special counsel Robert Mueller. The president's legal team is declining to comment on this, but a conflict of interest is one of the possible grounds that an attorney general can cite in order to remove a special counsel from office. Now, that is under Justice Department regulations that set rules for that job. Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort are all set to testify next week about that meeting with a Russian lawyer that happened last July. Kushner's testimony is expected to be behind closed doors. Randy?
So the issue with the conflict of interest with Robert Mueller has been there from the outset. And now we have Republicans looking at this whole thing and saying, we need to shut this puppy down. Trey Gowdy appeared on the Sunday shows, leader of the House's top investigative committee. He went in on special counsel Robert Mueller for allowing news media to learn that he and his legal team now have charges in their Russia investigation. Here's a quote. In the only conversation I've had with Robert Mueller, I stressed to him the importance of cutting out the leaks. It's kind of ironic that the people charged with investigating the law and the violations of the law would violate the law. This is dirty. This is ridiculously dirty. There is no validity to this. There never has been. We are investigating now simply because of an orchestrated drumbeat consistent on the side of the Democrats that was begun as trying to force Trump out of the race. When that failed, it became a drumbeat trying to delegitimize his candidacy. And it was always put out there as there's a cloud hanging over the Trump administration. Yes, it's called the United States press, and those who are part of the permanent government who are more progressive than any elected official, more in favor of the New World Order than any elected official of either party in Washington, D.C. That's what this is about. If you honestly believe with what we know publicly and all the leaking like a sieve that's going on, because they're still leaking, if you think all of this is going, and now the calls for resignation, Donald Trump, if he wanted to, could basically have a pardon pin ready and a form letter, and every name that comes out in charges, unless it is something that has not already hit the public, and we don't know what that, well, it could be something different. Yeah, it could be, and, Captain Kirk could fly over with the Enterprise and have Scotty beam us all aboard. Yeah, it could happen, but the likelihood that that is going to be the case is, well, not exactly high. We're seeing an end game here, which is not an end game. The progressives are getting all worked up, particularly the black ones. Yeah, we're going to get an impeachment when pigs fly. There's nothing impeachable here because you've yet to tie Trump himself to anything. You've yet to tie anyone who had a close enough relationship with Trump to anything, nor have you demonstrated that Donald Trump, like Richard Nixon, you've yet to demonstrate that Trump has tried to stop anything. This is just craziness. But we will see who gets picked up as early as Monday morning, and then the circus will move to another tent. And I'm going to turn this over to my good friend, Ron Edwards, and after that we'll be back with hour 2 of Black Man Thinking.
How low can you go?
How low can the Democrat Trump haters go? Hello, I'm Ron Edwards. On today's page from the Edwards Notebook, it is bad enough that Democrats and complicit Dragon Media gumps repeated over and over the series of evil lies on President Donald Trump, claiming there was collusion between the Donald and Russian officials to influence the American election process. Mrs. Clinton, her campaign, and others who knowingly paid for a dossier full of fake news about the so-called collusion should be expected to answer for such madness. And speaking of madness, then Secretary of State Mrs. Clinton compromised our national security by selling at least 20% of American uranium deposits to the Russians, who gave $31.3 million to the Clinton Foundation, while a Russian bank paid Bill Clinton a cool $500,000 to deliver one little speech, all of which is finally under investigation by Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Charles Grassley. It is high time we the people take seriously the clear and present danger that many career politicians are to our republic as a whole and the God-given rights we as sovereign individuals are blessed with. Such traitorous acts, along with spreading lies designed to divide and harm our republic, must be met with a full dose of justice. I'm Ron Edwards.
Sponsored by the Tri-County Liberty Coalition.
I have a dream. One day, this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
Black Men Thinkin.
Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you are dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Black Men Thinkin.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Black Men Thinkin.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Black Men Thinkin.
Stanley Levy here with Hour 2 of Black Man Thinking on the dominant force of Internet Conservatism, TalkAmericaRadio.us. Also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia. WJHC, Talk 107.5 North Florida Talk Radio. Freedom in America Radio.com. And WLBB News Talk AM 1330 in Carrollton, Georgia. I have a question. I've been around the sun more times than I care to recall at this point. I do not recall ever hearing the news media so worked up over what a president might say to what we now call Gold Star families. I don't recall it. I don't recall it with Barack Obama, and a whole grip of folks died while Barack Obama was president. I don't remember it during Bush's time. There was a lot of focus on the number of people dying, but not too much focus on what he might say to them when he spoke to them. It didn't become a news cycle all on its own. Can't say that about Clinton. Couldn't say that about Bush 41. Couldn't even say that about Reagan, and go back and go back and go back. I just don't recall it. I could be wrong, but I don't recall it. And I don't recall it being brought up in such a way with the obvious intention of casting aspersions on the character of the commander-in-chief. Nevertheless, that's what's going on now. There has been the accusation against President Trump that he was disrespectful toward a Gold Star widow, Maisha Johnson, regarding his conversation with her involving the death of her husband, LaDavid Johnson. Now, interestingly enough, a congresswoman, Democrat congresswoman, alleges that he was insensitive, and she admits that she did not hear the entire conversation. So she excerpted what she would, and she's already a political opponent of Donald Trump, and she cast that in the worst light possible. Then it's the follow-on as well. The wife said that he was disrespectful too, but in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, she readily admitted that she did not recall everything that was said. But you want to hit the president anyway. Of course, another Gold Star widow, who was also a black woman, released an audio tape of her call to the president, which was not only respectful, but also knowledgeable, showing that the president had done enough research to know the man's name, to know the name of all 5 children, and to know that one of the children was on scholarship at a major university in these United States. He was corrected by the widow when he thought that the son in college, because he played football, was there on an athletic scholarship, and the mother corrected him to say that he was actually there on an academic scholarship. None of this is new. So I have one woman saying that she was disrespected, but she cannot recall the conversation. And I have another woman who has audio tapes showing that the President of the United States was anything but disrespectful. Which one should I believe? But that's not the end of it, of course. Well, Donald Trump could release this and prove that. Why would you, as a president or anyone else who had any compassion at all, just to satisfy the news media, why would you make public a private conversation? Who does that? I digress. But more recently, within the last couple of weeks, another interaction with Gold Star families came up in which the president made an unusual gesture. PBS, interviewing a Washington Post reporter, presented this information in this way back on the 18th of October.
Army Corporal Dylan Baldridge was killed in Afghanistan in June. He and two fellow soldiers were gunned down by an Afghan police officer suspected of an insider attack. Baldridge's father was disturbed by the details of his son's death and expressed that to President Trump in a phone call. Mr. Trump then apparently took an unusual step for a commander-in-chief. He offered money. Dan Lamoth helped break that story for the Washington Post. Joins me now. Thanks for joining us. So how did this phone call go?
Yes, so several weeks after this soldier's death, the president made a call to North Carolina, where the father lives. They had a conversation that the father describes mostly as respectful. The father expressed some frustration with the way that the death gratuity, basically a benefit that the family received, was going to his ex-wife rather than some part to him. And the president's response caught him by surprise. He said, well, I'm going to make sure that we write you a $25,000 check, basically for your troubles.
And did that check ever arrive? The White House said that they sent it late today.
Yes, so we reached out this morning and received no response for several hours. As of today, the father had not received a check. So the assumption here would be that the check had not been sent until we reached out to the White House this morning to verify this father's report.
And you discovered this conversation in kind of the story has a larger context. You reached out to several different families, Gold Star families, for what happened after their family member died.
Yes, I mean, we've got this larger conversation this week. It's a very sensitive, very politically charged conversation. And at the center of it are grieving families. So we thought it was important to reach out to those grieving families. Some of them obviously and understandably did not want to speak to us, but quite a few of them did. And we found that about half of the ones we reached 13 different families that have lost loved ones since Trump became president. And half of them had received calls from the president, half of them had not. The majority of the ones who had not were upset when they heard his comments earlier this week that he had called all of them.
And there was even some families, or at least one family, that had not received anything, no phone call or even a letter.
Right, and you wonder what's going on there, because, I mean, that is something that is typically just generated. There are form letters of sorts that the president then signs. There was a time during the height of the Iraq War where we had hundreds of American casualties per month. We're now looking at something on the order of several dozen this year, so it's a much smaller amount. So for this to slip through the cracks at this point is very much a surprise.
How different is this from when you say logistically? I mean, when you think about the number of casualties that were happening in the middle or the height of the Iraq War or the Afghanistan conflict, how different is this time period than what perhaps President Bush or President Obama was dealing with?
It's an order of magnitude smaller. At the height of the Afghan war, we were talking something on the order of 400 or 500 American fatalities per year in combat. At the height of the Iraq war, we were talking several hundred per month. So at this point, I mean, we do have casualties. Each one is sad, but it's a much smaller number. And for the White House to have not kept up was a surprise.
All right, Dan Lamoth, the Washington Post. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So the implication is very clear that, while there are just so few deaths during Trump's time as compared to Barack Obama and George W. Bush, that he should be answering he should be calling everyone. He should be sending a letter, making phone calls. This should be his job one. And it's never been that way for any president. Is it an important responsibility? Yes. Is it something that they consider sacred? The ones of whom I'm aware in dealing with that responsibility did consider it a sacred obligation. But did they send condolences by phone call with every person who had lost someone in the military? No. Not a phone call. Did the person get a letter? Sure. Was it from the president? Not always. So now what we want to do is, of course, impose upon Donald Trump a standard that was not imposed upon his predecessors. And of course, the implication is that Donald Trump lied, because conversation was back in June. And now here we are in October, and he said $25,000. Now remember where the $25,000 came from. Donald Trump talked to a father who had lost a son, and he understood that the death benefit, SGLI, for those who do not understand, that comes to the family, that the father, because of the way the thing had been structured, was not going to receive any part of the death benefit with regard to his son. It was all going to the ex-wife, the young man's mother, and since they were divorced, there really wasn't much reason to expect, and there was no way to compel her to share any of that benefit with the father. Donald Trump saw that as something that was unfair. So he said, you know what, I'm not going to mess with the government. I'll write you a check. And of course, now, October 18th, it had not arrived. However, on the 24th of October, there was this report regarding that incident.
When FedEx arrived on the Baldridge's porch in Zebulon,
I noticed the address said the Trump Organization.
Jesse Baldridge had an idea of who it was from.
A very nice letter from the White House.
What's it say?
It says, Dear Christopher.
Christopher is Corporal Dylan Baldridge's father. He didn't want to go on camera tonight, but it was back in June, weeks after Dylan was killed in a Taliban attack while deployed in Afghanistan. Christopher got a call from President Trump, a condolence call, and something else, a promise to send Christopher and Jesse $25,000. 4 months later, it's arrived.
I hope this will make things a bit easier, but nothing will ever replace your son, Dylan. He was an American hero. It is a check made out to us for $25,000.
The Baldridges made national headlines last week after a Washington Post article detailed the president's promise and that check that had never arrived. But Dylan's family insisted they weren't angry at all, never expecting the money would come.
It's been hard. There's been a lot of negativity, and that's really unfortunate because the whole goal in this pursuit is kindness.
She's talking about the family's goal of using the president's money to start a foundation in Dylan's name, a nonprofit aimed at simply helping people, first in North Carolina, then the country.
We are going to be doing a fundraiser for a local preschool right here in town.
With a gold star in the window and on his stepmother's lapel, Corporal Baldridge is a constant presence here. The president's check will go to ensure his legacy of service lives on too.
Dylan would be proud of this. I mean, who can say they've started their foundation from a loan from the President of the United States?
Joel Brown, ABC 11 Eyewitness News.
Now, before the progressives and the Negroes, as I call them, get into this, no, it was not a loan. The young woman misspoke. It was a check, free and clear, to her, I imagine, from Donald Trump. It wasn't from the United States government. It was through his company, signed by him. Well, how come it took so long to get there? Have you ever tried to get somebody a personal check for anything involving their government service and not pay it through government channels? Do you know what that takes? Do you have any idea what it takes to get the clearance to do that through outside channels? What that process is? I'm not saying I know, but there's also the other thing is like, I don't know that the president writes his own checks. I know he probably signs them, or he probably signed this one, or they're automatically signed. And I don't think this was the only thing that Donald Trump has had on his mind since June. But I do know this. The promise was made and the promise was kept. Well, it was 4 months later. When did Barack Obama write a check to anybody for their loss? He had plenty of opportunities, both for people that were dying on his watch in Afghanistan and the many more who seem to be dying on his watch in Chicago. I don't recall Barack Obama giving anyone or even offering anyone any type of material compensation for their loss. Neither do I recall the press making an issue of this. Where am I going with this? This is a smokescreen. It's not going to work simply because, despite what people are trying to say about Donald Trump, he simply is not that person. Donald Trump is not someone who lacks compassion. He's not someone who is mean. He's not someone who tends to say something and not make the effort to follow through on what he says. That just doesn't seem to be who he is. Is he a perfect man? I would sincerely doubt that. I don't think that in the least. But neither do I think he's what his enemies are working overtime to portray him as being. Of that I am confident. Especially when the people who they believe he is harming come out and speak in direct opposition or contradiction to what is reported about Donald Trump by the press. He was disrespectful. And I got another widow. He wasn't disrespecting me, but you said he was disrespectful. Well, I really don't remember the conversation. Oh, what am I supposed to take from that? He says he's going to give you a check. Do you have it? No. But if you heard the young lady, they weren't even expecting the money to come. They just thought it was something being said to comfort them at a particular time. But the money comes. Well, Donald Trump just did that so he wouldn't be embarrassed. The same Donald Trump who, with no provocation or request, put up Jennifer Hudson, and her family in 2008 after various members of her family had been murdered in Chicago, and provided security for them. That Donald Trump. Oh yeah, he's just a liar. He doesn't care about anybody, especially not anybody black. Jennifer Hudson's pretty black as far as I recall. The same Donald Trump who gave the use of his private jet to fly a 3-year-old kid suffering from a breathing abnormality who needed treatment in Los Angeles, he sent his plane from New York to L.A. to fly that kid back to New York to get treatment. Yes, that Donald Trump has no compassion. Get out of here with this foolishness. If you want to go after Trump, I'm sure you can find something where there is much more fertile ground to plow. But trying to say that Donald Trump does not have compassion for people in need, you better go check what's going on the ground in Puerto Rico. He's not unpopular in Puerto Rico. You better go to Houston, where 2 black women, one of which said up front, I didn't have a very good opinion of him, but now that she has met him, she thinks he's a wonderful man, and she's a black woman. You better move on to something else. Stay on Twitter and criticize him for using Twitter. Stay on policy and try to find fault with his policies. But if you're going to try to find fault with the humanity of Donald Trump, I think you need another plan. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinking. We'll be back right after this. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinking, here on the dominant force in Internet conservatism, TalkAmericaRadio.us. Also WVDQ Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia. WJHC Talk 107.5 in North Florida. Freedom in AmericaRadio.com and WLBB News Talk AM 1330 in Carrollton, Georgia. Just when you thought it was safe to consider, and I just mean consider, paying attention to the NFL again as a reasonable sports entertainment option, the foolishness starts again. And this time, it starts this way.
After Texans owner Bob McNair referred to players protesting during the national anthem as, quote, inmates running the prison, many Houston Texan players wanted to walk out of Friday's practice and had to be persuaded to stay by the coaching staff, according to multiple reports. Along with the near walkout, star wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins skipped practice due to the comments, according to ESPN's Adam Schefter. McNair made the offensive remarks at an owners' meeting pertaining to players protesting during the national anthem and later apologized after his comments were made public by ESPN. All of this scrutiny of McNair comes just 2 days prior to the Texans' Week 8 matchup with the Seattle Seahawks.
So, Bob McNair, owner of the Texans, Houston Texans, at an owners' meeting discussing the protest, said we can't let the inmates run the prison. Now, the interesting thing is everybody now assumes what he meant. He's talking about the players. Is he? He didn't think so. But I guarantee you all of sports media and all of the NFL players, most of whom wouldn't know Bob McNair if he walked up behind him and slapped him in the head with a 2x4, are now confident they know exactly what he said. And sports media is, guys, if you do not understand how progressive and how far left of center sports media in this country is, then I don't even know how to begin to help you. Here's what you got out of CBS regarding the comments.
Houston Texans wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins took a personal day and missed practice today. That was confirmed by head coach Bill O'Brien. Multiple reports say Hopkins missed practice. Rightly irate over the commentary from owner Bob McNair at the owners' meetings last week. O'Brien didn't comment when asked if that was the reason why, which tells you all you need to know. ESPN.com had a detailed report of the meeting in an article that hits the website this morning. And it included this quote from McNair on NFL players kneeling during the national anthem. Quote, we can't have the inmates running the prison. What an awful, clueless, irresponsible, tone-deaf comment. Now, McNair did issue a statement apologizing, but it's too late. The Texans players were angry today, rightly so. Dwayne Brown, offensive tackle, offered some interesting perspective when he ripped the quotes. And he said he's not surprised. Pretty telling. And what a mess. Brown stressed this isn't the last we've heard on the issue. I believe you're going to see something on Sunday. And I totally get that. Now, Bill O'Brien met the media in his usual Friday press conference, and he said he supported the players 100%. There are multiple reports that the Texans players wanted to walk out altogether today, but we're talking to staying. Bill O'Brien is a great man and did the right and only thing by supporting his players, not the man writing his checks. Now he's got to get his team ready for a huge ball game in Seattle. Texans are 3-3, Seattle 4-2. It's gigantic. So big, in fact, we were planning on making a big deal out of the game on CBS before McNair's awful commentary was revealed. And these comments are just too awful to even characterize as a distraction. The Texans players will forever feel differently about the owner of the team. Here's a guess, and it was my take before this conversation. Deshaun Watson is going to lead the Texans to an upset special win. I'm calling it right now. They are going to rally around each other and beat Seattle in Seattle.
Bold words, ridiculous words. That was not sports reporting. That was social justice warrioring under the guise of sports reporting. It's ludicrous. Now, the interesting thing is Sports Illustrated ran a story which is actually a little bit balanced. It basically says, and I'll quote here, players think that Bob McNair called them inmates running the prison. But did he really do that? The players think so. DeAndre Hopkins, who was a wide receiver, skipped practice, and ESPN reported he did so out of anger at McNair. The threat of a revolt for the whole team was real enough that Texans coach Bill O'Brien actually felt the need to say his team would show up for its game in Seattle Sunday. McNair issued an apology, but Seahawks star corner Richard Sherman tweeted in response, "Don't apologize, you meant what you said. Showing true colors allows people to see you for who you are." Sherman's teammate Bobby Wagner tweeted, "People saying how they really feel." First thing, there are not enough black players in the NFL who understand anything other than a racist black perspective. That's all they have. They're not objective. They're not fair. They're not balanced. They're barely, and to be honest with you, a lot of them are not even American in their perspective. They think they're better. They think they're special when they exist in a career that on average lasts 4 or 5 years. And they're overpaid for that career. As with most of the stories, it's really not that simple. The players' anger is understandable. Owners have treated them less than respectfully for years. The NFL has not respected the concept of due process in player discipline. That's a true statement. I think NBA players in generally feel like they have power and owners respect them. NFL players don't. And if players think owners haven't supported them lately, it's because owners haven't supported them lately. Many players see anthem protests as a call for social justice. Owners see it as a business concern. And we are not going to, as owners, allow your social justice calls to come in on our time and hurt our business. I don't know of any business owner who would. It's that simple. Yet Bob McNair's comments have been twisted and set on fire. He did not say NFL players are prisoners. I know people are acting like he said that, but that's clearly not what he meant. He was trying to say players should not run the league. Every owner agrees with him on that. It was a bad choice of words. But people with a real perspective, a real world perspective, which does not include people who've never had a real job and get paid ridiculous amounts of money to play a game with a ball. You don't run this. You don't own it, then you don't run it. And for every one of them who thinks differently, Beyonce already has a song for you. There'll be another you in a minute, because you're nothing but a twisted ankle away from being unavailable. On the PUP list, as they call it, physically unable to play. And when that happens, the game does not become unscheduled. They simply get the next man up. And if he plays better than you, you may never see the field again. That's the nature of sports. That's the nature of professional sports. Now, does the owner have a right to say what he said? Of course he does. Does it mean he thinks badly of players? No. It's like, this is our business. We can't let these people who don't have a business concern, they don't care. And guess what? They expect their checks to be written and paid no matter how they do damage to the business. You're going to let those people run the business? I don't think so. Anyway, as a result of all this, DeAndre Hopkins, had his butt hurt day. And you have members of the Seattle Seahawks, which include, of course, the lineman who lied about the defensive lineman who lied about his interaction with the police in Las Vegas, Michael Bennett, who said that somebody put a gun. It's amazing how quiet everybody went on that. It'll be back. It's just a matter of time. But that group is now saying that they know what another owner thinks. Richard Sherman, no. Richard Sherman's a dirty player anyway. I really don't care what dirty players think. I don't know anybody who should care what dirty players think. But the real issue is this, and this is back to the SI story. I didn't think McNair's comments were the most offensive comment by an owner in that ESPN story. Washington owner Daniel Snyder, referring to the Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, is quoted as saying, "See, Jones gets it. 96% of Americans are for guys standing." That is a big deal. Now, what they want to say is that is offensive. No, that is a reality. The overwhelming majority of Americans who are responsible for there being an NFL in which people can play and generating these TV revenues and everything else, the vast majority of the public says that the players should stand. Jerry Jones understands that. He also understands you can't sell a product by disrespecting your customer. America is your customer, and the vast majority of them think that what you're doing during the national anthem by not standing for whatever reason you have is wrong. They don't like it, and they've already started to reduce their support. There are plenty of people who have walked away from being concerned about the NFL, which is bad for business when you are an entertainment business. Remember, the NFL produces nothing. There is not anything that changes in anyone's life for the worse if they do not consume the NFL's non-material product. It only hurts the NFL. But that is considered offensive, and there you see you have the problem. Oh, by the way, they did decide in response to the terribly offensive things said by Bob McNair, in their opinion, to do the following.
After Bob McNair's inmates running the prison comments, the Houston Texans players made clear there would be a protest. During the national anthem prior to their game against Seattle Sunday, a vast majority of the roster knelt.
All but about 10 players. 53-man roster, remember. So 43 out of 53 players were on a knee. A number of players on the Seattle Seahawks side were seated, including Michael Bennett, the one of lying about the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department fame. And you remember that prediction that the guy from CBS said? He predicted that DeAndre Watson was going to lead the Texans in an upset special. No, it didn't happen. You went out, took a knee, and lost. They lost 41-38. So not only did you demonstrate that you are overly sensitive, little snowflakey people, overpaid, underperforming snowflakes, you basically allowed your feelings to get in the way of doing your job, which is to win football games. You failed. You know, when you do that on other jobs, you make a habit of that. You may not have that job very long. The Texans can feel any way they want to feel about the owner. The owner doesn't owe them anything other than a paycheck and work conditions that allow them to perform at their best. If we're going to give in to, and I'll call it like I see it, if we're going to give in to the female and feminine mentality that you need to make me feel good about myself so that I can perform, you know what? Let's put a price tag on what it takes to make you feel good, and let's deck your compensation, monetary compensation, by the amount it takes to make you feel good. And that amount should be determined by the person who's making the compensatory payments. This is craziness that you guys are doing. And it really needs to stop. But what's really going to happen now, I'll just call it. Whatever momentum the NFL thought it had toward pulling this thing together, they now have another problem. Bob McNair is not the problem. Daniel Snyder is not the problem. Jerry Jones is not the problem. Black NFL players are demonstrably and measurably hurt hurting that brand. And someone's going to have to make up their mind what to do about them if the NFL is going to get back to the numbers to which it has become accustomed. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinking, will be back right after this. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinking, here on the dominant force in internet conservatism, TalkAmericaRadio.us. Also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia, WJHC, Talk 107.5 in North Florida, FreedomInAmericaRadio.com, and WLBB News Talk AM 1330 in Carrollton, Georgia. Final segment of the show. Let's talk about this division foolishness, shall we? All I hear about from left and right is the progressive lie that the nation is divided. The truth is that the nation is less divided now than it was before Barack Obama was elected. Well, there was a no, you're not hearing, you have to hear me to understand this. When Barack Obama was elected, it put the majority of the government in the hands of the ideological minority. How do we know they were the ideological minority? They passed Obamacare with not one single vote from the other major party that is represented in Congress. And as a direct result of that, the American people spoke and took the House majority away from the progressive Democrats, turning them out in droves. And the Democrats have not sniffed the majority in the House since. It took much more time for them to get a majority in the Senate. They didn't get that majority until 2014, which meant you were well into the second term of Barack Obama. If you look at an electoral map and just do the red-blue thing, you can drive a car from the California coast all the way to the Atlantic coast without one time driving through a congressional district represented by a Democrat. You now have 34 governors, if I remember correctly. 34 out of 50 governors are not Democrats. 68, if I remember correctly, of the 99 state legislative chambers in this country do not have a Democrat majority. When you say there is a divide, there is not an electoral divide in this country. You have liberal pockets in California, San Francisco, Los Angeles, in the Northeast, pretty strong throughout the Northeast, and certain other places not really in the middle of the country unless you count Chicago. Let's not forget that during the Obama years, the Democrat Party lost 1,000 elected office seats that they were holding. They were switched over to the Republican Party. The division that is being portrayed to you is false. The issue becomes the majority that used to lead is extremely vocal and very well practiced at getting out their message, even when it's false. A matter of fact, especially when it's false. We still have racism in the United States. The majority of the American people do not believe that they are racist. They do not believe the country is racist. They do not believe that black people or even the majority of Hispanic people are suffering systemic racism or victims of white. They do not believe that because they look in the mirror every day and see who they are. Now, is that to say that there is no racism in the United States? No. There's racism in the United States. And some of that racism is practiced by the very people who cry about white racism. Blacks, in a 2013 Rasmussen poll, were demonstrated to be the most racist group in America, even in the opinion of other blacks. Blacks thought black people were more racist than whites or Hispanics, Latinos. The division is a matter of ideology, and it is the minority ideology in an effort to maintain relevance that keeps putting it out there. This is not created by Donald Trump. Donald Trump did not create this division. Donald Trump did not exacerbate this division. Donald Trump started talking about the division in real terms that Americans can understand. We're not interested in division. We're interested in moving the country forward. Now, this is what you do when you say that. We're going to move the country forward. Everyone who wants to come with me, let's go. Turned out it was an electoral majority. Everyone who doesn't want to move with me, you can go with Colin Kaepernick and take a knee. Colin Kaepernick is still unemployed. Walked away with $14.5 million so he could take a knee and get nothing for it. Bless his little silly heart. Division is the province of the Democrat Party and the Democrat National Committee. It is their stock in trade. Because the only way they can win elections and thereby exercise any political power is to divide the nation up into special interest groups and convince each one of those special interest groups that the only way that their grievances, real or imagined, can be addressed is by politically supporting the Democrat Party. The war on women, bald-faced lie. We have to deal with this pay gap. You mean the same pay gap that is exacerbated by Democrat office holders? Hillary Clinton pays men more than women. Barack Obama paid men more than women. Yet they were out there championing, even trying to sign legislation to make it illegal to pay men more than women. Yet they did. Bernie Sanders is anti-1%. He thinks they're evil. He thinks everybody should give up their money. So why did he take a house, a $600,000 summer home? $600,000 is a lot for a house in these United States. Now, granted, there are some parts of the United States where $600,000 doesn't do much for you. But in the majority of the United States, $600,000 is a nice house. He took that bribe. But he's for the people? If you're a man of the people, why do you take a bribe from someone you criticized as not being of the people? His criticisms of Hillary Clinton were not gentle, but she was able to buy him off. Again, the Democrats need the division. They need blacks to feel like victims. They need the homosexual community to feel like victims. They need the immigrant community to feel like victims so that they can find ways to pool them together in voting blocks large enough to vote for Democrats. The problem is, particularly for blacks, where that occurs, blacks suffer. And the interesting thing about blacks, and some others, but the interesting thing about blacks is even though voting Democrat destroys their communities, destroys their family, keeps them politically irrelevant, blacks don't see what's going on. It's just identity politics and victimhood. And those of us who are black, as I am, and have to deal with what I call the Negroes, and I spell that KNEE-GROWS, we recognize how lost they are. They don't. They don't recognize that what Malcolm X, whom they seem to want to idolize, some of the time anyway, was speaking directly to and of them when he said, when you go out and support a political party that controls so much of the government so that they are actually able to get elected, and then after they get elected, they don't remember who you are and what you need, you're a political chump. And not only that, you are a traitor to your race. So for all the black people out there who have a different ideology than I do, I simply believe what Malcolm X believes about you every time you pull the lever for the donkey party. You are a political chump and a traitor to your race. But now that is changing, not for black people, not for people of Hispanic descent, not for any other quote-unquote ethnics, as we like to call them in the United States, because everybody who isn't Caucasian is considered ethnic. But now Caucasians or whites are starting to lose the guilt complex. That doesn't mean that people aren't still trying to lay guilt on them, but finally, and I think this is a great thing for the United States of America, they have decided that I'm not responsible for what I didn't do. I don't practice racism. I'm not going to hold myself responsible for racism. I didn't own slaves, so I don't want to hear about your reparations from me for something with which I had nothing to do. On that point, the whole thing about reparations, the country owing that, people don't recognize that the Confederacy was limited to 10 states. 10. And despite the importance of the Civil War, by the war's end, most of the United States was moving on in different directions. Not that the war didn't affect it, but if the war was going on in 10 states and then up the eastern coast, and you were in California, it really doesn't affect you that much. They don't take that into consideration. They don't take into consideration that 40% of the United States population can trace their entry into this country to Ellis Island, which wasn't even opened until nearly 3 decades after the Civil War was over. White folk are getting a clue, and they're not buying into the guilt anymore. And they're not acquiescing to having other people mischaracterize them. They're just not going to do it, particularly not for political purposes, to try to make them responsible for and for the problems of others and the guilty source of funding to resolve all those problems. Let's not forget, Detroit is a black Democrat production. Has been since the 70s. White people didn't run that place into bankruptcy. Black Democrats did. Because at the end of the progressive ideology, there is no economic plan. There is no achievement. There is no growth. There is no real education plan. It is an ideology of extraction. The problem with the progressive ideology is you need those who do not share it to be the source of funds that you extract. Because if everybody's a progressive, you have Detroit. When everybody's a progressive, you have New Orleans. Doesn't work. Back to the division discussion. It's simply not what you think. You believe the divisions are between people. It's really between ideologies. It turns on a dime. You want to see your idea of divisions go away? Go to where the hurricanes hit. Go back in 2016 in Louisiana where those rains hit and caused terrible flooding as well. You want to see what separates Americans? It's hard to find it when disaster hits. Very hard. You need for someone, progressives, to stir the pot of discontent. I've been American all my life, proud of it, and know good and well if something happened to my neighbor, Even though I don't visit them, whether I go see them or do anything else, if I find out something has happened to my neighbor and it comes to me that they need help, then I'm going to go help them. Do what I can. I'm not going to ask if they share my ideology. I hope they do, but I'm not going to withhold care for them if they don't. And that's the exact opposite of what you hear coming from a lot of black people nowadays. They want to paint all whites with a broad brush because of their ideology. Not the white ideology, not the ideology that whites have. Their ideology, the black ideology, that all whites dislike blacks, hate them. All police officers are murderers of blacks. These divisions represent a small part of the country. Let's remember, black people only make up 13%. If you're going to fight this lie about division in the United States, it starts with doing what 96% of Americans want folks in the NFL to do, according to Jerry Jones. You need to stand up for the national anthem, for the flag. By that I mean you need to stand for the values of the country. And if you do that, when you look across, you will see very few people who need to look like you to be part of your nation. Melanin does not determine Americanism. We need to get this together. We can. But the idea that we're not together as Americans is not true. We have people who simply don't want to be Americans. They're in the minority, and they need to be dealt with kindness where we can, with decisive action to stop them where kindness does not work. And that's our show. God bless you. God keep you is my prayer. Look forward to seeing you next week if the Lord says the same. Until then, you take care.
You've been listening to Black Man Thinkin' with your host, Stan Levy. Join Stan midnight to 2 a.m. That's late Monday night into early Tuesday morning. And find him on the web at Black Man Thinkin' without the G. That's blackmanthinkin.com.